Welcome, my friends, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. It's Friday. It's a philosophical day. Happy to be back in the co-host chair with Duncan. Duncan, how you been, my friend?
Good, Brad. You feeling better?
I'm getting there. I'm incrementally feeling better. I don't feel bad anymore. I still am stuffed up, but cognitively feeling quite good. Pretty sad about my Vegas trip that went nowhere. We're 0 for 2 for hanging out together in the real world, but third time's a charm, as they say. And what can you do? What can you do?
That's exactly right. And in your own words, that's a bad beat, right? So
It's a bad beat, but you know what? Like, it's a first world problem, right? Like, it's an inconvenience, something that was kind of annoying, just having to sit in my hotel room, quite close to a lot of my close friends, who were all in Vegas at the same time, and all the podcast guests. That was pretty much a downer, but I can go back. There's next year, and gonna be doing some wolf retreats with my guys, and gonna be inviting some folks like yourself and other major contributors and friends in Greatness Village along the ride as well. So we got plenty of opportunity. Just gotta wait till next time with the non-COVID opportunities.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. What's on the agenda today for Philosophical Friday? What are we getting into?
Right. So speaking of some interesting things like intuition and uncertainty and all of these mystical topics, we thought it would be a good idea perhaps to explore alternative forms of intelligence that they apply to poker, and in particular, the concept of emotional intelligence. So we're going to try to see how it applies to poker, what some characteristics, how can people improve it if possible, and so on.
I'm uncertain how this episode is going to go, but my intuition tells me it's going to be good. So let's dive into emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. And one starting question would be what is emotional intelligence? And some people would define it as the ability to understand, use, and manage your own emotions in certain ways to relieve stress, communicate effectively, which matters to us, like empathize with others, which also matters to us, overcome challenges, and potentially diffuse conflict. So it is a way to essentially deal with emotions, if we were to summarize it in a single sentence, as opposed to using and manipulating cognition, which is the more typical definition of the intellectual quotient, as opposed to the emotional quotient, like the typical intelligence.
Right. And as I believe I've mentioned on this show, watching a lot of Brene Brown, who believes that we are emotional creatures who have cognition. I would say that, emotions are certainly a big deal. They're very real. And I don't know if you mentioned it in the definition, but I know that you did, but to simplify for me, I think of it as both understanding your own emotions and also understanding other people's emotions as they're feeling them too.
Absolutely. And that's where the empathy is derived from. You're absolutely correct. Like, unless we can actually understand our own emotions and also understand that there's a connection between our emotions and other people's emotions, right? I mean, humans are called humans because they share something. Otherwise, they would be called something different for each person. You cannot empathize. Right? So that's where the empathy is being derived from.
Yeah, and I see. So the next question is it a thing? But I would actually kind of, yes, my answer would be yes, that's to that question. But secondly, I would like to define like what an emotion is. I think that's like an important thing to think about here when we talk about emotions. Like what is an emotion to you, Duncan?
Sure. I guess I'm going to give an answer which may feel unattractive to some, but I would say it's basically a response of our nervous system, right? Just an immediate response of our nervous system to the triggers of our environment, right? So, for example, fear is a response that tells do not go there. Or love could be a response that tells us,
go there.
Exactly. That's it. We solved, like the hardest psychological questions of our time.
Let's
Let's
call
call
it a
it a
day.
day.
We're done. Yeah.
Absolutely. But yeah, that would be probably the shortest version, right? Because it is something that, again, it doesn't have to do with cognition. It's a physical thing. And that's why I would call it a response of our nervous system.
Yeah. And it's a physical thing related to our central nervous system. As you said, I would define it the same. And then also, I think regulated by chemicals in our brain too, that affect our emotions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And neurons and all of the stuff that are involved in our physiology.
Exactly. Yeah. So, all right. Now, how does this apply to poker? Emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. So let me pass that question to you. Like, how does an emotionally intelligent human being, which we can, for the listener here, we can define as someone who is aware of those responses of the nervous system, is aware of their own emotions, other people's emotions, typical responses, typical behaviors. How can such a human being apply those ideas to poker and potentially benefit from it?
So, in my opinion, poker's an emotional game. I think starting from that paradigm, and when you start with that belief system that poker is an emotional game and that humans act irrationally and emotionally in moments of stress and pressure, which poker is ripe for stress and pressure, it gives you an insight into how they're constructing their strategies and what they're trying to accomplish and what they're trying to do. And, their physical tells, through betting patterns, through mannerisms, through speech, there's almost an endless amount of data points in the world of live poker that you can read emotionally and that can influence your decision.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the examples that I often give is the idea of somebody at the poker table tilting, and sometimes they can be silently steaming. But again, if your antennas are on, you can literally feel the temperature of the room rising, like somebody is actually lost a
What do you
hand.
feel? What do you feel when you steam, when you tilt? Like, what does that mean?
Right. So I was thinking of it as an observer, but as like a person who, like, let's say I am the person
Yeah.
who feels the negative emotion. Literally, like the temperature of the body rising, the like a representation of a headache, I would say. Like, the head is actually working overtime. At least that's my physiology. I'm sure that other
What
people may feel.
feeling? What feeling would you
Mm,
attribute?
I would say the probably anger. I would say that's the closest of the and perhaps usually the anger is also related, I would say, to probably fear. And I think if I were to pin it down, the reason why I'm also adding fear in there is because I guess fear could be and it's difficult, right? I mean, because when we try to describe emotions, it's actually very difficult for me to put it into words, right? Because I can show you how I feel. It's very difficult to describe to you how I
Yeah.
feel, right? Yeah.
Just looking for the adjective.
The adjective, right? But I'm going to take the challenge, and I think what happens there is any sort of loss typically triggers the emotional response of fight or flight, because you feel threatened, right? I mean, at least I would probably say that this is accurate in my case. So I would say fear, anger, fear of loss, anger for an outcome that irrationally we deem at the very moment as perhaps unfair or more unfair than it should be. What else?
Where do you feel tilt at the poker table, like in your body?
I would say, personally, I would say probably my head the most, and my stomach probably personally,
Yeah.
yes. And I have to say that like over the years, the symptoms have changed, right? Because again, and they tend to be less intense and they last shorter periods of time. I believe Sam Harris said it best when it comes to anger. one of the things that he said about, like being in emotional control, which is easier said than done, he said it's not about not feeling fear or not feeling anger or not feeling negative emotions. It's about understanding their existence until they dissipate. And I'm paraphrasing him, but that's essentially. But yeah, so typically, like I would say, stomach, head, pretty much the entire body. Sometimes a tingling sensation in the fingers and things like that. And
Yeah.
yeah,
It's quite different for me, interestingly.
I wanted to ask you, like, how does it feel?
Yeah, so for me, it's in my chest.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I breathe, it's a feeling of urgency, always urgency. Like I need to do something right now. I need to resolve
Mm-hmm.
this thing that's going on. So I feel urgency to do something. And depending on the day, it could be desperation, right? It could be this sense of like, dealing with a loss and like this desperate urgent sense to like get back to even, do something,
Right.
push the action, make
Right.
sure you get involved, right? And I think that's really it. I don't know. Anger doesn't really come into play for me. I don't think. I can't really remember getting angry. But lack of control, I think, is one feeling that sort of like, when I feel out of control, I think that is a catalyst to feeling urgency and feeling desperation. Like I just can't, there's nothing I can do about this thing that's happening to me. So you feel helpless in a sense. I think that's mostly how like my tilt manifests internally. And it's like a very specific feeling, it's a feeling of when I was a kid and like my mom was supposed to pick me up from school and she didn't show up for 2 hours, right? It's this helplessness,
Right.
this desperation, this like out of control. Like I have this major problem and I can't resolve it. And there's nothing I can do. So yeah, that's sort of how like my internal central nervous system like processes tilt and things at the poker table. But it's a very tangible feeling that I'm quite familiar with as a human. So I can recognize it relatively quickly, and it's an indicator to like do something, like take a walk, take some deep breaths, stretch, or just quit the game entirely.
Correct, when it comes to you. And actually you can also see it on other people as well. I mean, because also the kinesthesiology of other people changes when that happens, right? I mean, people tend to, it's subtle. You may not be able to put it into words, but you know it when you see it, right? I mean, you know when somebody's mannerisms change. Like, for example, let's say they were chatty before, they stopped talking, or they were not moving as much, and all of a sudden you see simple twitches on their body, like moving left and right a little bit at a faster and more erratic pace. So there are things that people are doing which are very telling that they're off their emotional stability. And of course, no words would be able to describe it as our senses can feel it, I would say.
Well, in the same way that nonverbal communication is like most of our communication, and yet we can't like pinpoint it, why we feel it. Like this is like, to me, related to our instincts, our conversation on intuition, where like I intuitively think something's up with this person. They're not acting normal, even though I can't like describe why. It's just like something's different, right? And this can happen like, we described, or what I described was this sort of like, that's like a big feeling, a big sense of helplessness. I think that there's also micro emotional responses in specific hands that can affect you in ways that you unanticipate. And as you mentioned, like somebody becoming chatty or not chatting as much or whatever it is, it could be posture, mannerisms. They could fall into, our good friend, the bias of sunk cost fallacy, where they've, invested like 20% of their stack and they've played like a rock all day. But now that they've made this 20% of their stack investment, they go off like a rocket and chase bad money with good money. So like there's just a lot of ways that emotions can manifest. And when people think of tilt, they think of like this atomic bomb going off, but it could also be very micro, very subtle in ways that you just, honestly, if you didn't think about it, you would never think that you tilted.
Very, very good. And it can be as simple as basically any deviation from your typical game would be tilt, and it can be as simple as fatigue. Like some people can be fatigued and then not making the right decisions. That can also be a form of tilt.
So basically we just need to identify tilt, right? Just some factor that is reducing your ability to perform at your own personal standard.
Correct, exactly. Any deviation, I would say, any deviation from that personal standard is a form of tilt. And like with everything,
what's the opposite of tilt?
I guess
inspiration,
stability, maybe. I mean, we can give a lot of words, but I mean, consistency, like, your typical, but it's anything that basically, I would say, it's like asking what is the opposite of having a fever in the way that I'm thinking about it, right? The opposite of having a fever is, for lack of a better word, is not having a fever, meaning that you have your typical temperature, whereas any deviation from that is a degree of fever. You can have a little fever, you can have a lot of fever, you can have, hypothermia, so you go in the other direction. So that's how I typically think of tilt. Any deviation from some sort of like normalcy, whatever that normalcy is for your strategy, any such deviation would be a tilt. And I guess, speaking of that, we can also add that even when you're trying different things for the first time and you're deviating from a certain strategy, that is a temporary form of tilt, even though it is a purposeful tilt, if you will, according to that definition, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know about that in my definition, because in my definition, it's like tilt is just, it affects you in an unanticipated ways, and you do things that are outside of your strategy or outside of what the goals that you're trying to accomplish in the game. And if you're trying to learn and you think something is going to perform quite well, but you're unsure and it's still inside your strategy, that seems to be like a conscious, logical action to take. Sure. And so, but I mean, the opposite of tilt for me, I was thinking of like the Felix drink from Harry Potter, just like, you just drink the drink and everything goes well. You win all your flips, you make all the right plays, you bluff catch correctly, you bluff correctly, everything just works. And just the inspired version of poker where you're bulletproof.
For sure. But for the record, what you're describing there, like, trying to learn new things, we can also call it, and again, I mean, definitions are calling things names, but we can also call it in some sense like positive tilt or control tilt, or, you just have a deviation which is under control. But
yeah, if or I could just reject your definition of tilt,
or reject it. It is easy. I love it. So speaking of which, what are some characteristics? Like we mentioned tilt, and or the lack thereof, or the control of tilt, or anything like that. But what are some characteristics of emotionally intelligent people, or people who aspire to be emotionally intelligent?
I would say people that talk about it. That's like kind of jumps off the page. If somebody's trying to prioritize the way somebody put a bet in the pot, or the way somebody was feeling at the moment that they were playing a hand, and they're describing a hand to you, and they're like, yeah, it just felt like they were on tilt. It felt like they were taking an aggressive action inappropriately. Mm-hmm. Somebody that verbalizes a data point like that, they're probably thinking in an emotional way, right? Mm-hmm. They probably are, whether or not they're consciously aware of exactly what they're doing. I think they're looking at poker through the lens of emotional intelligence in order to discern what's going on, or to make the best decision that they can make. And people that never mention anything like that ever, and it's all technical. There's no like timing tell. There's no anything like that, are probably not thinking about poker from the emotional perspective.
Or feeling poker from the emotional perspective.
Or feeling. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Feeling, man. I think everybody's got to feel, right? You got to be some kind of sociopath to not have any emotion or feeling when you play poker. This game is just inherently emotional, in my opinion.
Right. But I would say, again, I would go back to the degrees. Again, when I'm saying people are not feeling, what I really mean is that their response to feelings is very low. So the degree to which their sensory, or like the nervous system or anything like that, their sensory components, the degree to which their sensory components reacts to emotional things around them might be minimal. That's what I mean.
It could be. It could be that they just don't have awareness of how they feel
Right.
emotionally, right? It could be like
That's
a
also a thing.
lack of emotional intelligence, right? Because
Right.
you know, I was doing an optimization session with someone. It's been years ago now, but I asked him a question about like, when was the last time you felt like anger? When was the last time you felt frustrated or confused or something like that? And it was obvious, like in the session, that they had been feeling frustrated and angry and confused,
Right.
but they were not able to label their own emotions.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know when the last time they felt
Right.
confused or frustrated were, even though like they were feeling confused and frustrated in that moment,
Right.
even, and they just were not aware of how they felt.
Right. And to some extent, that's equivalent to as if this never happened to them, right? I mean, it's like as if it's not there. Like being not aware, it's similar to being unconscious. I mean, you may be alive, but you're not sure you're alive. You know, like it's the same. The same.
Are we alive, Duncan? What is life?
I'm uncertain to this.
How do you feel intuitively about it?
Intuitively feels like it, but maybe we're in dream or a simulation. I have no idea.
I hope so. That'd be sweet.
That would be interesting. But to add to this, I agree with you. By the way, 100%. It is very important to be aware, and one of the ways we can tell is that by talking about it. You know that somebody's aware if they actually try to verbalize it, or sometimes people can actually try to show it too. They don't necessarily have to use cognition to describe their emotions. They can show you that they're feeling some emotions too. That is another alternative way, but they need to express them somehow. And they should be aware that they're expressing them, is what I'm getting at. But another thing is, and that ties to the concept of intuition we've been discussing before. Another thing is that a lot of the things that we do in real life have data points or are based on data points that we have previously collected, sometimes unconsciously. And that's what later is being translated as intuition. So the idea of, I don't know what it was, but I felt the opponent was strong, or I don't know what it was, but I felt the opponent was weak. This is potentially.
Do you act on that?
Personally, I do. I used to not to. I used to actually override it, like because I thought to myself, you know what? It is so much more important to look at the patterns. But I realized that I was basically neglecting one very important data point, or several of them, at the poker table.
Yeah, I think that self-trust is just kind of essential for the live poker player. And the times that I listen to my intuition, the time that I trust that gut feeling of how this person's feeling in the moment, they tend to work out very, very well. The times that I go against it tend to go very, very poorly. I've just learned over time that, like, you know, it's an intelligence that I can't exactly put my finger on where it's coming from or what exactly it's based on. However, I do trust my central nervous system. I trust my brain to process that information subconsciously and give me an indicator. And then I just trust that, because I mean, really, like we trust a lot of things. Our body has a lot of automatic systems and processes internally that we trust, right? Like I would assume my heart is beating right now. I can't really prove it, but I think it is. I'm breathing in and out. My lungs are working. You know, we talked about COVID earlier, right? The whole autoimmune system is just this amazingly complex piece of us that just works automatically. You cut your hand, your body heals itself, right? Like, I mean, that's like almost magic, what's going on there that we have no control over. So why would it be the case that we're able to do these things automatically, but then we're not able to process information about people's intelligence and even their like energy and electricity, right? Like this is maybe a more controversial thing, but like the human brain is electromagnetic. We use energy. That's how we do things in the world, because of energy. And so, like, we have an electromagnetic pulse that you can read. Like it's like an aura, right? Whenever you say, this person gave me a bad feeling, right? That's something I always trust, because to me, it's electrical. Like there's something there. They're putting out energy that is like, it's telling me, it's basically triggering something inside of me that's telling me beware of what's happening. And there could be no outside indicator that something's happening. It's just this like gut primitive feeling. And I'm like, yo, I'm not going near that person. Like, I don't know what it is, but that person, I can't do it.
Absolutely. And for the listener, I want to basically underline how important that point is, because at least for me, it was incredibly important. That was actually exactly what you just said, Brad. It was something that I was missing. What you just did, you basically took something that looked incredibly mystical to me, like, and then you explained its sources. And that was my initial fear, that all of this, intuition or all of these gut feelings, they're potentially, and that was the old me, they're just potentially, mumbo jumbo. They're potentially, some sort of like the variants,
red herrings, or
red herrings, or like things that actually it is a form of variance that comes to us in a weird way, right? I mean, you just given enough time, everything will happen. So even if you're right about somebody, you might have just gotten lucky, pseudoscientific and all of that stuff. But you're absolutely spot on and on the money that there are, first of all, there are just very simple physical triggers. Like you said, for example, the electromagnetism is a real thing. So people actually do have different physiological responses in their bodies that we can actually feel them. So it's very physical and very real. And also to that, I would add that, again, intuition is also very real in the sense that it accumulates, like a subconscious mind, which is constantly on, literally accumulates data points which are unaware of in real time, but nevertheless, they do happen in the background. And it does, therefore, does machine learning for us. And it informs us when certain situations are dangerous just because it has seen that danger before. And that danger, it may have seen 10,000 years ago, when some of our ancestors whose genes we have inherited, learned how to deal with these dangers. And for me, that was actually a really important moment, because I realized that, Duncan, this is not necessarily voodoo magic, and this is not necessarily something that is weird, and it's some sort of like variance playing tricks on you, and sometimes you're going to be right, sometimes you're going to be wrong. It could be millions of years of evolution, basically.
Yeah, it's natural selection, right?
Natural selection, exactly.
Our genes have survived for a reason, because they pick up on these feelings and they're able to not get murdered. And exactly, we stay in the gene pool, right?
Exactly right. For me, that was an aha moment, an epiphany, right? Because I was very much afraid, and I'm always very much afraid, because let's be honest, there is a lot of pseudoscientific things out there, right? And it's very easy, to fall into the pitfalls and all the things that are happening. And 9 times out of 10, when you hear something that feels weird, it is actually weird. It's probably too good to be true, to be fair. But you made a very good point. You made a very good point about the physiology and the fact that, as humans, we can feel those things.
Yeah, for sure. And to be honest, like, I'm more easy breezy than you in that sense, that like, I feel it, I trust it, and then I just kind of like move on. It's like, yeah, let's trust it, and we're just going to go with this. I don't need proof really, or evidence of it. I think in the same way that, like, basically my experience is my proof, and my experience is my evidence in that sense, where in the same way that, like, meditation, in the 80s, before there was science, people that meditated swore by it and said that, like, this is beneficial, this is benefiting my existence, I'm living a better life because I'm doing this thing. However, they couldn't quantify it, right? There was no science and data that showed the benefits. But when science did catch up, they realized, oh yeah, this is actually really beneficial, and it's like very healthy and very good for you, which is, what anybody who's meditated for thousands of years could have just told you through their personal experience, right? And so, yeah, like, I tend to trust my experience of those types of things, just because it's super arduous proving anything, and that's we'll call it laziness.
No. Actually, this is another excellent point for the listener, right? Because, and actually, Nassim Taleb, it's nothing but laziness. Actually, it's an intelligent way to respond to the environmental triggers, and it's also a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach, right? I mean, it's like the example people give sometimes is that a bird didn't learn how to fly by reading a book of aviation, right?
Yeah,
that's very important. And actually, Taleb makes this point in his book, Skin in the Game. game, where he talks about the idea that we survived far before science existed. So this is actually very, very important. And it is important for us to understand, and for all the scientists out there, it is very important to always use science as a tool and not as the end all be all. So you're absolutely correct that our experiences matter and all of this. The only thing that I would add is that now science can help us understand the things that we've been doing for so long, and which I would also, by the way, call it science. The idea that, we're using data points, that's what science is all about. Like, I mean, we use the data points from the past, and then we make inferences about the present and the future. So to me, that's a primitive form of the scientific method of science. So it's great. So science, what can do, it can actually make that more concrete, perhaps use the right terminology, look
more efficient, more
efficient.
optimal.
The inferences and all of these things make the connections. And now it's going to be easier for the next generation to reach those conclusions a little bit faster, right? I mean, they can still use their experiences, but also they have the cognition to help them in that direction. So I wanted to clarify that it's not lazy at all. As a matter of fact, it is the way we have survived for all those years.
Yeah, for 38 years. That's the way we've survived. You could also just look at like other forms of life, right, that survive. We don't have to like think about humans as the only ones. We have cats around here. You may hear a cat meowing sometimes on the podcast. Well, they don't have a scientific method and they don't have science, and yet they're here and they're surviving and they're living in this world. And all the other animals with less cognition than us don't have science, and yet they're still going about their business and doing their thing. So
correct. Or one can say, again, they're using a primitive scientific method, right? I mean, again, because they're responding to specific.
Yeah, they are, and they're also using the power of genes and natural selection that just helps them survive. They're built to survive in this world, because if they weren't, then they wouldn't be here.
Correct. Exactly. And someone can even say that those evolutionary traits and forces are, again, a form of primitive scientific method, right? What works and what doesn't, we discard that which doesn't, and we keep that does.
Yeah, I mean, on a really big timeline, I think that's pretty much what life is doing, right? It's just like iterating, learning, dying, learning, iterating, dying, just like slowly getting better with each iteration. That just seems to be the path.
Absolutely. Or the iteration of the alarm that they're checking today in my building. I apologize for that.
Yeah, you need to go kill that alarm. Get that alarm out of the gene pool, man.
Right.
What's
Get
going
it out
on?
of the gene pool. That's exactly right. So here's another question, right? I mean, that people may be interested in. I'm certainly one of them. What are some ways to cultivate emotional intelligence? What are some ways to improve it? And is it possible to even do that?
I have to imagine that it is possible to cultivate it. And, asking questions, reading books, reading things that, people who have dedicated their lives to the study of emotions have written, like a Brene Brown, right? Mm-hmm. Like just educating yourself. I think that's really a good way. I mean, if you think about like physical tells in the space of poker specifically, that is engaging in your emotional intelligence. It's improving your ability to read people and how they're feeling, and their mannerisms and all those things. So like, yeah, I think reading, practicing, and if you play live poker, like I said before, try to at least consider the data point of emotions within your framework for making decisions. And the more that you consider it, the more that you think about it, the more you'll learn. And that's just, I mean, to me, feels like the point of life. The thing that you focus on is what you learn about. And if you dismiss it and don't focus, well, you're probably not going to learn.
Very good point. And you also alluded to that idea earlier. We think cognitively, right? I mean, that's how we communicate. We use words, and we have to use our brains to be able to communicate for the most part. So in order to talk about something that doesn't use words and doesn't use cognition, we need to actually do something else. And that we need to basically focus our cognitive attention to that thing. So in some cases, people may have emotional intelligence and they may not even know it, or they may not even be able to articulate it, just because you don't need to articulate it to have emotional intelligence. You just need to feel it, right?
Yeah.
So
Let me use an example here that's outside of poker for
Mhm.
emotional intelligence and like how emotions, how we prioritize emotions typically.
Right.
Like you meet someone who, logically is great fit. They have a great job,
Mhm.
a very attractive person. They're intelligent and witty
Mhm.
and clever,
Mhm.
but you don't feel any emotions when you're
Mhm.
around them. They don't give you that sense of like, joy and bliss, and you just don't have that, right? And then you meet somebody else who logically, maybe it's not logically a great fit, but there's chemistry, right?
Right.
Who are you going to be with, right? You're not going to choose the logical choice. You're going to choose the emotional choice. And
Right.
in my opinion, you'd be a fool to choose the logical choice with somebody that, isn't going to be a great long-term companion, because you just don't feel all the things when you're with them and around them, right?
Right.
So that's, to me, like an outside example of poker of how we prioritize our emotions over logic in a lot of senses. And by the way, over prioritizing the emotional side of this equation can lead to doom and
Problems.
disaster on its own if there's like a lot of like red flags that logically you see, but then you just look past them, right? Where I'm not really speaking to that, but I'm speaking more about chemistry and the way that you feel when you're in the presence of someone. And if you don't feel anything, well, it's probably not good to pursue a relationship with that person, no matter how logical or how much it just kind of makes sense to everybody else looking from the outside.
Absolutely. And like with everything, I mean, ideally, you would probably have both, right? I mean, both the emotional attraction and the logical attraction.
Yeah, let's be greedy. Let's be
yeah,
greedy
let's
here.
be greedy, right? Why not? We only live once, right?
Yeah.
So, but you're absolutely correct. I mean, the emotional attraction is very, very relevant and very important. But before we even do any of that, we need to be aware of its existence, right?
Yeah.
Because if and sometimes people are gravitated towards a certain direction without necessarily being able to articulate it. That's enough. If you can actually make decisions based on that. But it does help. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Basically, I just realized that like you also have to trust your emotional feelings too. That's a major part of this, that you trust that gut intuition regarding a relationship with someone.
Mhm.
Because again, when you don't trust it, at least when I haven't trusted it, bad things have happened. Like
Mhm.
I've been my distrust has been validated time and time and time and time again, no matter how much I don't want to believe it, no matter how much I'm like, no, I really want this, like I really want this to make sense. And then it ends up like, yeah, you were right intuitively about the situation. So like you need to trust your ability to discern what your emotions are telling you, which is like maybe even step one that's beyond awareness of the emotions.
Mhm.
You have to trust the feedback that you're giving, the data points that your body's giving you, and it's very easy to mistrust them or to under prioritize them for one reason or another, right? And the example that I gave before, it's like, but this is a perfect fit. It's logical, right? These emotions, I'll have them one day. Like this like weird feeling is just like, maybe I'm just like commitment phobe, right? Maybe I'm just like afraid of committing, or maybe it's X, Y, or Z, and we just kind of dismiss it or push it to the side. But yeah, I'm a big believer in trusting the way that we feel. And if you trust the way that you feel and bad things happen, then you got to calibrate, right? We got to learn what's happening there. That's also information and not necessarily a bad thing, but we need to learn and not make the same mistakes again and again and again.
Absolutely. And I would say that that's where cognition can be of help, because on the one hand, I would agree with you that yes, we need to listen to the emotional voice, but sometimes, and I think you mentioned that earlier, it can lead us astray too, right?
Sure,
So
absolutely.
so the cognition can actually help us. Like one example on the other side would be like some sort of like physical trauma. Like for instance, I've been bitten by dogs twice in my life.
Yeah.
So as you can imagine, I cannot go. I've gotten better over the years, but I cannot go anywhere near dogs. It's actually a funny sight to
Yeah,
watch.
I just am imagining you like climbing a tree and like a
Oh,
chihuahua chasing you or
yes.
something. It's the
I'm an Olympic athlete. Near dogs, I become an Olympic athlete.
yeah, yeah. You terrible athlete under normal circumstances, but it just goes crazy whenever a dog is around.
That's exactly right. Um, Dog, these things are wolves, So anyway, and the thing is that cognition can actually, help me navigate through some of these circumstances. So the less intimidating of these dogs, I can perhaps up to a certain extent, and that's how I was able to overcome some of my trauma, right? Get closer to them, and little by little, be able to overcome it.
Interestingly, regarding dogs, they can sense emotions and stress as well, right? So
Absolutely.
whenever you're stressed out or you're afraid, the dog can sense that, and they can process that in a way that may not be great for you, right?
That has been my excuse for the past 20 years at least.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
that's what I tell
that could be not good for you. I could say I've never been attacked by a dog. I've never been bitten by a dog, and when I see a dog, I'm just happy if it lets me pet it. That's, so that like, there's no fear there. But the dog is sensing emotions and it's sensing all these things as well. And like, if you're afraid, then it's probably wondering why you're afraid of it, right? Like, why is this thing, afraid of me? Is it going to attack me? Is it all these things? So it gets defensive in the same way, because it wants to survive. It doesn't want somebody with bad intentions getting behind it and taking it out of the gene pool.
Absolutely, that's exactly correct, and it's doing the right thing, and it creates like this vicious circle. But but at the same time, my cognitive ability tells me that I see how most people react to dogs, how most dogs react to most people, and I can see that there's certainly something wrong there, right? And this is a situation where my initial response, up to a certain extent, is not to necessarily be trusted, and that's how it can help me overcome the trauma. So I would say that both the intellectual quotient and the emotional quotient can work in tandem. They can help each other to be able to prosper, and I think that can potentially be relevant. But specifically for emotional intelligence, I think paying attention or simply just acknowledge it exists can actually get us a long way. And I think, Brad, you've been doing, like, since we first met, you've been doing an excellent job actually articulating all of these, and that was even from the very, very first podcast. The idea that not only humans are emotional beings and they're led by emotions, but articulating those responses to their environmental triggers, and you're very good at that. And I think the listener can learn a lot from that approach, being able to articulate it, being able to see it, so that when it happens again, you can say, oh yeah, not only subconsciously, but consciously, I've been there before.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's very kind of you to say. I would say, there's a flip side to this before we shut it down, is that your emotions, so like, it's hard to discern between like intuition and emotions, and sometimes, especially in poker and big spots, your emotions can definitely lead you astray. Like, they can definitely lead you towards risk aversion. They can definitely just manifest in a situation that feels like it's similar to another situation that you've previously experienced, like the dog, for instance, where you got bit. However, it's nothing like that situation at all. It just feels the same, right?
Right.
And that can lead you to poor decision making at the same time. So I'm a big fan of data, as everybody knows. So collect the data and don't shy away, don't hide from the data, and just look at these decisions when you've made them based on one emotion or the other. Track them and see how things are going, so that you can quantify, because like it would be kind of a tragedy if your emotional calibration was awful and you're just like torching money, but you're like, no, I trust it. It's going great. Good things happen when I trust my emotions. And yet all the evidence and the data is telling you something totally different. So, I mean, again, track this stuff, track the data, and give yourself a really big sample size. By the way, this is
Absolutely.
something
Big sample size is exactly the point I wanted to pinpoint on, especially if you don't know the opponent long enough, which again goes back to the big sample point, because you maybe have a feeling about a certain person, but if you haven't been with that person for a long enough time, this could easily be a false positive.
Yep.
Right. So you can use your population tendencies, which have been tested and have been working for you. And once you have enough evidence about that specific opponent, then you can let, the emotional intelligence come into play. So the way I like to give a heuristic about that is you can use your emotions or your emotional stability or your emotional intelligence. You can use it as tiebreaker if the situation is too close. So you can go either way. You can either call or fold, let's say. So you can use your antennas there. You can use your intuition if everything else tells you, you can go either way.
Yeah, very nice. Very good. Makes sense. Is that where we tie the bow on? Cut it off? We got anything else left to talk about regarding
Absolutely.
EQ?
I guess on a fun note, I was just going to give a story of something that happened in the trip like a couple of times. And
well, it must be nice to have a story.
Oh no, it makes me feel so bad right now. Oh man. So you know what, depressing stories, give them enough time and they will become comedy too, right?
Yep.
So one of the things that I saw a lot on this latest trip to Vegas is that people, and I hadn't noticed up to that day that it was happening. I mean, my intuition would tell me, okay, yeah, that person is weak, but I never articulated it until this trip. So every time somebody was struggling with a decision, they would actually do this following thing. They will take a little bit of a breath and they will do this, exhale. And when somebody's exhaling, which makes perfect sense, right? I mean, people who will listen to this say, well, Duncan, obvious, right? I mean, the person is literally finally releasing the pressure from the rest of the hand now that they're not going to raise you on the river or somewhere. And now finally they have to make the final decision. Do I call or do I fold, right? I mean,
there's no benefit in holding everything in anymore.
Holding everything in, but it was subtle because they were still trying to be poker faced. Yeah. And it was subconscious. And actually, what's interesting about articulating this type of behavior, I noticed that I could notice it on earlier streets as well, which is interesting to me. That was pretty interesting because, again, up to that point, I mean, I've played with people for thousands of hours, if not hundreds, I mean, a long time. I played like a long time live and online too. But like it's an interesting response that I hadn't been able to articulate it before. So I could perhaps feel, oh, that person is weak. But now, I feel proud of myself that I can articulate it.
Yeah. You're bringing back some bitterness for me. You remind me of a story where I had the perfect bluff candidate against quite a good player who very intuitive player, actually taught himself how to play poker and moved up to playing 2040 no limit at Commerce. And then one day on a whim, just ventured over to 2040 pot limit Omaha and never came back, but just very intuitive. I always thought just extremely intelligent poker player. And got a lot of flack from the Commerce crew. They thought he was terrible, but I always thought he was good. And we played a big pot playing 2040 no limit. I think it was like a 20 or 30K pot where I ended up having I had 5-6 and the board was like queen 5-6-7 with like a flush complete here. Or actually it was like queen 5-6 deuce, something like that. And the queen paired on the river. So I had 2 pair on the turn, the queen paired.
3 pair. The proverbial
I have the 3 pair, right? I have the 3 pair. And I check raised all in on the river. And it was a giant pot. I had all my blockers. And I had a feeling they had a straight. And they ended up calling me. And I remember the hand because I am fairly obsessive about this kind of thing. And anytime something happens where I'm confused, I always reverse engineer what happened in the hand. What did I do? All the data points that led up to the decision to try to figure out when somebody does something against me that's weird. that works out, I'm like, what'd they know? Like, what information did they know here? What did I give off? And when you were telling that story, it just reminded me of on the river, because I had two pair. And when the river paired the queen and counterfeit my two pair, I remember being annoyed, right? Like, I got counterfeit. And I actually remember feeling that in my body. And then I checked and they bet, and then like it occurred to me, oh sweet, like I've got all the boats in my range and I've got like the perfect blocker to check raise here. And then I jammed and ended up calling with a straight, flush completed and the board paired. And my initial reaction was like, what a shitty call. And only when I started reflecting and thinking about the situation, I just realized like this motherfucker is so intuitive that like he felt how I felt on the river, and he just wasn't folding. Like his subconscious was like, nah, you got to call here. You can't fold. Whether or not he could articulate what happened, but I know that's exactly what happened because I felt that sense of like defeat or deflation when the queen paired on the river. And we'll never forget that hand for that reason, because initial response was like, wow, what a bad call. And then when I reverse engineered it and thought about it, I realized like, oh shit, there was something there that if they notice that, you're screwed. Don't do that anymore. So like, yeah, this is like the level in which I think about live poker and emotions and information.
That's great. And the word you mentioned, deflation, is exactly like the word I was looking for, like literally physically deflating, right? I mean, literally like, exhaling all the air from the body, like literally. This is excellent. This is perfect. And you're illustrating exactly the battle between emotions and cognition. And we're giving off two different tells. We're giving a weak tell emotionally and a strong tell cognitively, right?
Yeah, and then I picked the most intuitive player in the room to try to go to war with right there.
No. What I hear is you still remember and you learn from that example. It's not about the mistake, it's what we learn from it. Like that is like, I cannot imagine like a listener who's not really valued that highly, like the idea, the lesson learned from something like that. It's not like, I often tell my students, I've done every mistake known to man when it comes to poker. It's not about the mistakes, it's what we learn from them. That's a wonderful story.
Yeah, you got to ask, what did they know? What did they know that I didn't know in the moment, right? That's how you learn, by venturing into the unknown. But cool. Yeah. Good. Glad you drug that story out of me, Duncan. That was very fortuitous right here at the end.
Thank you for sharing.
While we're going to shut down this episode of Philosophical Friday, if you want to have episode suggestions, join Greatness Village, the Philosophical Friday discussion channel. You can ask questions about this episode or any episode. Give us feedback. Philosophical Friday is on Duncan's YouTube channel. Duncan, where can they go?
They can go on YouTube on Why Alex Beats Bobby. And you're more than welcome.
BBIE, by the way. I don't know why you decided to make Bobby so complicated.
It's the British version,
I see.
My publisher is British, so
I see.
My publishers, they're both British. Yeah. So we can start a conversation there, and the YouTube comments that would be great, and we can talk about these interesting topics. And find us on Twitter too.
Yeah. Awesome. All on the Twitters, and we'll catch you next week on Philosophical Friday.
Awesome. Take care, man.